Hello and welcome to Social Church. We're delighted to be joined by our guest Pieter J Lalleman today. He's the author of his new book, In the Power of a Resurrection. Welcome to Social Church, Peter.
Thank you.
Peter, before we start, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yep. I'm a teacher of the Bible at Spurgeon's College in London. I started by teaching the New Testament, and I now also teach the Old Testament, so I'm a kind of all-round Bible scholar.
Yeah. Okay, great. And how did you come to write this book?
It's, in fact, to be honest, a translation of something that I wrote in my own language, in Dutch, where I was asked to contribute a series of Bible studies, and I selected the Book of Acts because I know the Book of Acts rather well, and I teach it at Spurgeon's. And once the book was out, I thought, I might just as well translate it into English as well.
Yeah, good. You've designed this book to be full of application and really useful for group Bible studies. Tell us a little bit about how this can be useful.
Well, like everything in the Bible, in fact, it's okay to have knowledge about the Bible, and there's a lot to know about the Bible. But the Bible was written for us to be applied in our own lives. And so every time I write on the Bible, I try to make sure that we think about what it means for us. Yeah. Now, with the Book of Acts, that's not always so easy, because the Book of Acts contains stories, and not all of these stories tell us that the actors there, the apostles, were exactly right. Yeah. So you need to reflect a little bit on whether what they did was okay or not okay. Yeah. There's always something you can learn from a story.
Yeah. When you talk about Bible studies, you always think about a group of people getting together, and I'm sure many of the listeners would have been in that situation where there'd be a verse in the Bible. We'll go around a room and say, okay, so Peter, what did this mean to you? And by the time you get around a room, and we call this eisegesis, don't we? You get around a room and suddenly there's 6 or 7 different opinions about what a text means, and sometimes they're not corrected, and it can be really dangerous. So a guide like yours can be really helpful. Tell us a little bit about that, Peter.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. The Bible isn't always so easy to understand. Yeah. Partly because it's a rather old book. It's almost 2,000 years old now, and these people lived in different situations from ours, and therefore some good material that tells you what the original text actually says and what it might mean to us can be very helpful. And in that sense, my book can be used in groups, but it can also be used by individuals who just want to read the Bible for themselves and study it in a bit more depth. Yeah,
really good. Can you, as a scholar and as a teacher, Peter, can you tell us a little bit about eisegesis in terms of how people can put their own opinions and insert it into the Bible? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, you come across interesting situations, even with students of the college, where they see a word in a particular text and they see a word in another text, and therefore they think that the word always means the same thing, and those texts are closely related, which is not always the case. Generally, people don't listen to the particular text that they're looking at long enough, and then they start making connections with other texts a bit too quickly. You don't really get what God is trying to say to you in that particular book of the Bible. The danger also is that you then make everything a bit flat, because if you make too many quick connections between all kinds of parts of the Bible, then they all start to sound a little bit similar. And in the end you think, I've seen that before, and you lose what is so unique about that particular passage. Yeah,
that's really good. Tell us about some specific verses you've covered in this book and how you go about unpacking these.
Well, I didn't have space to look at all of Acts. As you know, Acts is a rather long book. So what I've done is I've selected 10 passages from Acts and I've studied those in a bit more depth.
Yeah, brilliant.
And the interesting thing is that normally people tend to focus on the beginning of Acts, and the beginning of Acts is better known. What I've tried to do is to take most of my passages from the second half of Acts. And so some things are addressed here that could be a bit neglected and not so well known, but very interesting and very nice stories. Yeah,
brilliant. Can you give us an example of one of your favourite verses that you've unpacked?
Yeah, what you get later on in Acts is that Paul travels and he settles in a city like Corinth and later in the city of Ephesus. And we have a lot of background information about Corinth and Ephesus from other sources, so we know what these cities were like and what kind of things normally happen there. And we then see that the author of Acts, who is Luke, knows the situation pretty well and tells us what Paul did in that particular situation. So we get confirmation effect of the accuracy, the reliability of the biblical stories.
As somebody who spent so long studying the book of Acts, what can you tell us about the relationship between Simon Peter and Paul?
Simon Peter and Paul. Well, what you see in Acts is that the first half of Acts focuses more on Peter. In fact, Peter is the main character in the first half. And then after a while, Peter disappears from the scene. Luke doesn't even tell us where Peter went. And then Paul becomes the main character. And so in the second half, it's all about Paul. But you also see that several things that Peter does in the first half are then repeated more or less by Paul in the second half. So there are quite a few parallels between what these two characters do.
Brilliant. Do we know much from studying the New Testament what their relationship was like? Because I've heard some people talk about there being a tension between the two of them at times. Do you know much about that, Peter?
Yeah. Luke doesn't say so much about it in Acts, although he does say that at some stage there was this discussion about whether new Christians needed to be circumcised. And so in Acts chapter 15, they have this big meeting where they discuss the issue. And you can see that initially Peter comes from one perspective and Paul comes from the other perspective. But Paul himself in Galatians tells a bit more about it, and Paul, in a way, is more open about this in Galatians chapter 2. And he says that he had a confrontation with Peter and other leaders, and that he convinced them that they were wrong, which is quite straightforward language. Yeah,
brilliant. What was your favourite part about writing this book, Peter?
What I like to do is to dig into the backgrounds, like what do we know about this Roman Empire, and what do we know about the people that Paul meets, like this Gallio, the leader in Corinth at that time, and to connect that to the story. But another thing is that you can show how relevant the words of Paul and the other people are for us today. It's an old book, but the gospel that you find in Acts is still just as relevant for us as it was in those days. Yeah,
brilliant. Where's the best place for people to be able to buy this book, Peter?
Hopefully the local Christian bookshop will have it. That's what local Christian bookshops are for. It could also be ordered from the publisher, which is called Apostolos. So it's Apostolos Publishing. And if nothing else works, people might go to Amazon.
Sure. Okay. Well, we'll put the links to those in the description below, Peter. Do you plan to write any more books in the future?
Yeah. In fact, I had already written 2 books with the same publisher. One with studies on the book of Revelation. And one about the lasting value of the Old Testament, because many Christians these days tend to ignore the Old Testament and to focus only on the New Testament. In the meantime, there's another book in the pipeline, which is about the relationship between the Old and the New. So I'm studying how New Testament authors use the Old Testament in quoting it or just alluding to it. And again, that book is out in the Netherlands in Dutch, and I'm translating it into English at this moment, and it should be out towards the end of this year.
Perfect. Just in time for Christmas, Peter. Brilliant.
Yeah, indeed.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much. If anybody wants to get in touch with you, Peter, are you on any of the social media platforms? Do you encourage anyone to get in touch?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook, but people can also find me on the website of Spurgeon's College. Find my email address there and send an email at the address of Spurgeon's.
Fantastic. Peter, thank you so much for your time, and we wish you all the best with this book, Peter.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you.